This is a webinar called Look for Risk Factors, Find Your Protective Factors. It's a webinar that I have done versions of before because I think it's important that we take a look at those risk factors and protective factors. And some of the history of risk factor, protective factor is definitely looking at it from children, which is very important. They have my heart. But it's also looking at the individual. And as we have progressed with the work that we've done with Ross Council's recovery-oriented systems of care coming into play, we are recognizing more and more the importance of looking at the risk factors and protective factors and how we build our communities. And that's one reason I asked Kyle to sit in on this. He's going to comment as we go through some of the slides of some of the things from that he has learned being part of Ross Council and being in on the statewide meetings and the things that they see being done. I think this can be an exciting time. So we are going to go. Here it shows I've done a lot of linking with Ross Council. So I've had Kyle set in before with me and had some input. And I think that that's really an advantage, as we go through things. I'm a casual presenter if you don't know me. And if you do, you're going, oh yeah. Because I think that we need to have discussions rather than being talked at. And I don't want that to happen. If you have something in chat, we will try and keep up with it. It's an exciting time in our field. So let's enjoy it and get what we can from it. The Illinois Family Resource Center, for those of you that don't know, started 9 years ago. It was supposed to be a year project, and here we are in our 9th year because it has had a lot of success and it's just grown in leaps and bounds, even through the pandemic. Recognizing the need that families have for support and that our communities have for support and health and wellness of our family units, however you define family. That doesn't mean it's your biological family. It means the family that supports you, that's important to you, that's there for you. How do we build those? How do we keep those happy and healthy? And how do we help families take care of themselves if they're living in the chaos of substance use disorder, mental health, gambling? Taking a look at that. And we have just been really lucky to keep expanding. We provide information, do not do direct service, although my background of having 40 some years in the field, I have done direct service, been certified as an addictions counselor since 1988. I worked in prevention at the state level for a lot of years. In addition, I have coordinated outpatient services, so I've got a lot of that experience to share, based on my time of working with people. I have an ability just to kind of look for those resources. And we talk with human service providers, with parents, significant others, Ross councils, other community groups through a variety of methods. And we do that in a lot of different ways. Here's some of them. Website postings. We do that on a regular basis. Facebook page, we have a Facebook page. Do webinars. This year we're doing at least monthly webinars. We will probably have some specialized webinars, maybe one on kinship care, the other one on fetal alcohol and drug exposure. That's one of our goals, as well as our ongoing monthly webinars. Do in-services. I've done them through virtual. I can also do those individualized in-service presentations. We're really lucky. We have just starting in September, we will have somebody up in the Cook County and Collar areas that will be joining me and working, doing a lot of the same things and reaching out to communities and to organizations and things, linking with how do we support families? How do we help that recovery journey for them be successful? How do we help them take care of themselves? That includes all the family. I will admit my passion is really the little ones, but I come from 4 generations of substance use disorder and mental health. So it's lived experience, folks. And I think that we've got a lot of good things going on. We can provide technical assistance. We can facilitate meetings, do a lot of conferences and exhibits and presentations at conferences. Fall's coming up. I've got 3 already lined up. And those happen to be up in the Collier County area of Cook County and the surrounding areas. But it's exciting. It's an exciting time. And we look at research information. We've brought on 2 staff people as we've grown this year. And so we're going to have a lot more ability to keep expanding and to look at those things. This is the next webinar coming up, parental substance use and the effects on children. Lisa Olwingert's doing it for us in September, and she will be talking about the Drug Endangered Children Alliance, both the national and the state alliance in Illinois. And it's really looking at how communities can come together. Here we're back to that community concept and support our families and children. Okay. My goal for you, and then I'm going to have Kyle talk a little bit about what ROSC is. Review the research-based family and community risk factors. We're going to look a little bit at that, discuss a variety of models for family and community protective factor and resilience building. That's really my goal today. There are several different strategies out there, plus some of the first really strong studies on risk and protective factors are still good, and we see variations of them coming through different, more current things, but I want to visit all of that and see how it ties together and what we can offer you in what you do in your role. We're going to explore strategies to enhance the protective factors and build resiliency that support recovery. I mean, that's what we're about, is creating healthy recovery journeys for the people themselves that have experienced the issues, as well as the families and communities that are impacted by that. The one thing I put on here, and then I'm going to have Kyle make a couple of comments because I think it's important. I found as I was looking through some stuff on the family impact, this came out a couple of years ago from the National Institute of Health. They were looking at ROSC councils, and they have stated how they've demonstrated such positive findings. And, you know, it looks like they've identified pathways to integrate partners with, you know, and family members where appropriate into these ROSC models. And ROSC models are community-based. And Kyle, I'm going to throw it to you for a few comments now.
It's awesome. Thank you, Nancy. No, so like over the last few years, the research has shown that, you know, it's not just an individual problem. Like, you know, a person who is struggling with substance use disorder and then they get into recovery, like when they were in their addiction, they affected everybody around them, like the family and then the community as well. And whenever somebody gets into recovery, the stronger the community is in supporting somebody who is in recovery, the better chance that they will have in maintaining that recovery. So as a ROSC, what we do is we go through and meet anybody in the community, like whether it be judicial system, law enforcement, substance use providers, mental health, healthcare, just anybody in those in recovery themselves, and anybody who has a dog in the fight. They all come together, and then we just, how can we make it better in the community? Because every community is going to look different. And every community has very their strengths that they're doing really well in, but they have some gaps and barriers also. So take that strength-based model and you go with the strengths, but you also try to work the gaps and barriers out of it. So and it helps, just that sense of community is very important. And Nancy says community in this webinar quite a bit, and because it really does come down to the community. And as a ROSC, that's what we try to strengthen. So
cool. Thank you. I was very fortunate when Illinois first started looking at ROSC. I was on that first committee that met up north at Governor State and looked at that, and I got to represent the side of the family. And then as different counties had lead agencies be funded to start ROSC councils, I work at the Our House holds the statewide contract for the Illinois Family Resource Center. And the Our House was one of the first cohorts for Ross councils. And it's been really interesting to see how the tremendous success these counties in this area have had. And I was also doing some mentoring a couple of years ago with new Ross councils. So I have a real firm belief that community organizations, there are others besides Ross councils that do wonderful, wonderful work with a lot of the same similar goals. But Ross nationally is really being recognized as having a lot of success and helping the recovery journeys. As we look at risk and protective factors, I wanted to give you some definitions, and it's always a good place to start is with SAMHSA. You know, that they influence a person throughout the entire lifespan. And whereas a lot of the studies have been really focused on children and how we protect our children, those same things fit with our communities at large, with our families at large. A lot of the things as we go through this, and I'm sure between Kyle and I will probably make those comments, people coming out of recovery need a lot of the same support systems that we're talking about providing as far as protective factors for our children. You know, it's where you're starting in life, meeting people where they are and building those protective factors. SAMHSA does some defining with this. Risk factors such as poverty and family dysfunction can contribute to the development, and we know this to be true, of mental and or substance use disorders later in life. That's where a lot of our trauma information, our ACEs factors come into play, is looking at that. Those are the risk factors that are out there. Risk and protective factors within one particular factor, such as the family, may also influence or be influenced by the elements of another, which means exactly what we're saying is that the individual and the community and the school and the family all influence each other, and we have to look at them as a package. The more we understand how risk and protective factors interact, the better prepared we will be to develop appropriate interventions. And that's pretty much a given. And it will strengthen our communities. Risk factor characteristics that precede and are associated with higher likelihood of negative lifestyle outcomes we're impacted at a lot of different levels. At our biological level, we know that if we're living in a family with the chaos of substance use disorder and mental health, that our health is being impacted. And psychologically, how we are addressing our environment and what our survival skills are and where we are on that continuum, it's impacted by the risk factors. Family and community level, a lot of that comes from the stigma, unfortunately. A lot of the impact on families and communities comes from the stigma around substance use disorder and the reaction of people that don't understand it. And then the cultural level, and we're hearing more and more about that, and we're looking at that. And I think that that's really important. And from the very early days, the early people that worked with risk and protective factors, that was identified as one of them. How do we meet the cultural needs of our individuals to build risk or to look at risk factors and protective factors? Protective factors are events, conditions, they're characteristics that we carry with us, that our children and families and our broader environments, which is our communities, what is there to increase an individual's chances of a healthy development, not only of development, just a healthy lifestyle. Positive life outcomes despite exposure to significant adversity is that building of protective factors, and it's very important. Just remember, Kyle, jump in if you have any thoughts.
Well, I do have a thought talking about risk factors, thinking like I myself am a product of the risk factors because I'm a product of divorce at I was like 3 years old. My dad struggled with alcoholism and other substances, and that caused chaos in the home life. And I just remember growing up, like, he continued to do these things and come around, and it just completely caused chaos. And then eventually, I kind of fell under that same storm. So the risk factors are true, and I didn't have a whole lot of protective factors
Mhm.
because I ended up in the same areas where there were other people who had the same struggles. So it was just, I would be grouped in with people who had parents who drank, or a parent who drank, and then I ended up drinking with those same individuals. So it's true.
Yep, that's good. Good, thank you. I want to share just the social development model, which was developed by David Hawkins and Rico Catalano at the University of Washington. They were some of the earliest researchers to really look at risk and protective factors. They were doing this 25, 30 years ago, and developing models and strategies to create healthy environments for primarily children, but they also had, as their work progressed, they addressed the whole thing around communities. And I think sometimes these models are lost. This was originally known as the Seattle Social Development Model. It was the basis for a curriculum for a parent program called Preparing for the Drug-Free Years that was very well known nationally and internationally, evidence-based program to offer to parents to how you build healthy children. And so I kind of want to share a little bit of that. I was really fortunate when I worked at what is now Prevention First to be able to go to Seattle and work with these people a couple of different times. I went to a training of trainers for their curriculum and their programming. We did a lot of that in Illinois. And I was really lucky to be able to interact with them and hear the reasoning and some of their views around the risk and protective factors as they had done their research. And as we look at the social development model, they realize that targeting only one factor when addressing risk factors doesn't work. You're not going to be successful unless you look at the whole big picture. And I think that you'll see that consistently mentioned. Here's some examples that were given. Communities That Care is a Hawkins and Catalano program, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Looking at relationships, example for risk factors, parents and caregivers who use substances, that have substance use disorder, caregivers that have mental health issues. They may have child abuse history or provide insufficient supervision. And that's extremely high risk factor that a lot of people don't see as being one of them that is as concerning as it is. Well, I was in the house with them. Well, were you watching to see if they were sticking their fingers in the outlets? Were they cooking for themselves because you couldn't cook for them and using knives and things that were inappropriate? A lot of those things. And yet the protective factors in looking at that is parent and caregiver support, parents that are involved, that function as a healthy role model. And again, it's a parent or caregiver. We know clear across our United States and definitely in Illinois, and this is one of my passions, having been a grandparent raising grandchildren and kinship caregiver for 2 different generations. I have a real commitment to, let's take a look at caregivers across the board. What kind of role model are they, and what kind of support are they able to give the children that are in their care, and the community impact then. Looking at communities, example for risk factors, neighborhood poverty and violence, neglected home care, and I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. Social norms allowing substance use as normal. Right? Do you live in an environment? Do you live in a community? Do you live in a neighborhood that it's okay? If your kids are finishing up your beer cans that aren't totally empty, that going out and partying is okay. That inappropriate use of substances is okay, that mixing drugs are okay. If that's acceptable in the social environment, that's a very high risk level for communities, which means it's a high risk level for families and caregivers because of the impact it has on the individual. Examples for protective factors there are the availability of parenting programs, faith-based resources, after-school activities, community supportive recovery. We keep going back to that. I want to mention the neglected home care. One of the things that Hawkins and Catalano's research showed, and I've read this in other studies since, I'm just checking my time here, is that in neighborhoods, maybe lower income neighborhoods, ones that don't have as many resources, the risk factor is when it's neglected home care, when there's broken windows that nobody's addressed, when there's empty houses that nobody's cleaned up the yard, when there's fences that are falling down, when there's junk dumped in the yard. That's a risk factor. It impacts you psychologically, it impacts you biologically. It has a lot to do with how you feel about yourself and your environment. The protective factors, you can take that same neighborhood and board up those windows, clean up the garbage out of the yard, fix the broken fences as best you can, and maintain that. And it changes the whole feeling of your environment, even though it's the same place. And I think that that's important that we recognize that. Another one, looking at the societal issues. Norms and laws favorable to substance use, which we've already mentioned as far as the other, and lack of economic opportunity. If there aren't jobs out there available, if there isn't training to get a job, you know, we've really pushed a lot of our young people, you got to go to college, and we've got a lot of people that aren't ready to go to college. But we can train them to be very productive in our communities and our environments so that they feel good about themselves. That lack of opportunity for the schooling and training is a risk factor. Yet examples for protective risk factors is hate crime laws are there, policies limiting the availability of alcohol or other substances, and providing opportunity, which I didn't get back on here, it came off when I was working on it. I just realized now it isn't on there. Those protective factors is providing the kind of training and things that we need to move forward in life. Any comments? The social development strategy identified some key components, which I think are worth taking a look at to increase protective factors. Healthy beliefs and clear standards for behavior. Young people, not only young people, but people fresh into recovery. Well, oftentimes they're really at the same emotional and developmental stage as younger people, are more likely to engage in healthy and social responsibility when their parents, when teachers, when the community that surrounds them, when the 12-step support systems are there to communicate healthy beliefs and clear standards for appropriate behavior for healthy recovery and a healthy lifestyle. It's important. Bonding. Strong attached relationships with those who hold healthy beliefs and clear standards is important to the protective influence. That's true for children. That's true for people, families, and people that are early in their own recovery from their use. And to create these bonds, there's three things that they identified. Opportunities, provide opportunities to participate. Provide opportunities for meaningful involvement with pro-social others, including families, schools, communities, peer groups. These are the recovery groups that are out there for people coming into recovery too. Any thoughts on that, Kyle?
Yeah, well, this slide reminds me of this youth mental health first aid training I just did. And then just having that solid, strong impact or connection with one healthy adult that, like, you know, pours into their life can help them out immensely. And the same is with recovery. You know, when I got into recovery, I had a very strong guy who just ended up sponsoring me in one of the 12-step programs. And, you know, I learned from his example, from what I seen and from what I saw is what I tried to imitate, because they always say imitation is the most sincerest form of flattery, you know, and a lot of what we learn isn't just what we're told, but it's what we see. And that's the same for children. And,
Absolutely.
to see those people doing, community things like being giving and, helping people out. That's what they'll see, but they'll also see the bad end of, my dad's drinking with his buddies again on a weekday, and it's natural, it's normal. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. Good thoughts. Thank you. Well, I think with opportunities, and we talk about peer groups, that's where we really build in the importance for people, families, and other people that are on a recovery journey to look for those support groups, the positive support groups. The other thing we need to do is what I already mentioned, skills. We need to teach young people and people early in recovery that haven't had the opportunity because of their using experiences, or families because of the weight they've carried living in that chaos. They just haven't had that opportunity or the knowledge to search for the skills that they need so that they can succeed. And then the recognition. People need to be recognized consistently for their efforts, for their improvement, for their accomplishments. That's one thing I always liked about 12-step is you go to the meeting, you get the coin. That coin says, I've done something. I know sometimes people go, oh yeah, that really doesn't mean anything. It's really not important, da, 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 da. But it is. It is. All my years in the field, I've seen too many people that those recognitions of moving forward in a positive way are so important. It's part of building the protective factors. I've got several things that I put up here just for you to see. I will send a copy of the PowerPoint out when we send out certificates. Communities That Care was developed by Hawkins and Catalano. It was used nationally in the United States by the juvenile justice system to go into communities and look at how do we build communities that care and can address the juvenile delinquency and the things that we see going on in the legal development. It went nationally. This is the cover to their UK version of their model. Been out there for years, but I think it's one of the models that you can't throw away because everything else that seems to have come after that is really based a lot on what Hawkins and Catalano did. This is the risk factors and things that they listed. I don't expect, I'm not going through this list, but I want you to know that this is available in that document. You can pull it off the internet. This is out of the Communities That Care, and I am going to take a look at this. I want us to go down through some of these things. Sorry about that, folks. Looking at this, it's just a really nice list of risk and protective factors. I would do it in a different order. I would do looking at the well, maybe not. If you look at the community risk factors that are there are ones that we need to be looking for as we are doing assessments of our community, and looking at the flip side of that is just such a good tool. I really want to look at the thing around family though, looking at poor family management and discipline, family conflict, family history of antisocial behavior, favorable parental attitudes to the problem behavior. Remember, this is the UK, this came out of the UK version. So you see that they use the spelling a little bit differently, but it's legitimate in what it's in. Looking at protective factors, attachment and bonding to family. How do you do that? Families have changed. We look at the tremendous increase of kinship care and children being placed there. So how do you have attachment and bonding to family? It's a different approach as we do your assessments, as you look at the needs of communities. That's one thing you're going to have to be aware of, is looking at the different things. In my family alone, we have blended family, traditional family, and everybody that comes together. And it's just, it doesn't look like it would have looked 30 years ago. It doesn't look like when I was growing up. So it's being aware that The environments have changed, and how do we build protective factors within that? Looking at opportunities for pro-social involvement in the family or within any kind of kin care issue is important. I want to check time here after my bleep. Recognition of pro-social involvement is really important here again. I'm going to skip the school, although they're an extremely important part of our community. The one thing I will say, people that staff our schools need to have more support and information around signs and symptoms that children live in a chaos, and that they're coming to school with that oftentimes their behaviors, the risk factors they're seeing, are created from the trauma of the chaos. It's created from the lack of care. It doesn't mean parents and kin care doesn't love them. It just means that they don't have the tools to appropriately care for them. And that's oftentimes due to mental health and substance use disorders. So the one thing that I will say is schools need more support and education. That's one reason those of you that know anything about Drug Endangered Children Alliance, I'm not going to go into that now, but that's what our next webinar is on. Link in. It's a good opportunity for you to see the role that the schools and law enforcement and child welfare and families how they can link together to help these environments be better for children and for people to understand what's going on. Then we look at the peer and the individual, the behaviors that are risk factors. And in order to counteract that, social skills, belief in moral order, emotional control, interaction with pro-social peers, how do you create that in your environments and in your communities and in your families? It's important to be able to take a look at that. This is just a good tool that I like, and it comes from a lot of really strong research base. I put some pictures of some resources here. These are resources with strategies that I'm going to talk more about, and I'm going to tie them in with the communities that care and a lot of the work that Hawkins and Catalano did, because their work is really the basis of what we're seeing in these other strategies. And this is community conditions that strengthen families, protective factors, work at the community level, which is what the thing that we were talking about. This was published by the Child Welfare Information Gateway. And if you are interested at all in looking at a lot of the work done with child welfare and the court systems and supporting families in recovery, go to their website, Child Welfare Information Gateway. It's childwelfare.gov. It's part of the Department of Health and Human Services. These books, let's see, I've got one right here. It's 70 some pages long, are free. Go on their website. You can order these. I ordered some and I had a package of 10 within a week. Great tools if you've got community group coming together, and they use a lot of the work in here that comes from the next slide. Whoops, wait a minute. This, I take that back. I gave you the backwards information. Sorry about that. Community conditions that strengthen families is actually the Strengthening Families program that has done lots of research for a long, long time. And that comes out of the Center for well, let me pull it up here. The Center for the Study of Social Policy. I've known it as Strengthening Families for years. And they have this great work. And they did a study in 2020. And that's what this book's about, is the study that they did generating protective factors. They pulled together groups of people and did a lot of interviewing to see what people thought was important as far as protective factors for their communities. And that was in 2020. And then the Child Welfare Gateway took that and put it into this publication that's now available. And I think that these are really good resources for you. You can pull the Strengthening Family stuff up. I will send the links to those of you that are on here so that you can pull up at least the executive summary, and it gives you some real good information. They have taken that into this document and integrated that study. So all this stuff based on some of our earliest studies on protective and risk factors, we're seeing grow into what we've got here. Any thoughts, Kyle, on what we've been doing since my oops? Okay, here again, 2020 Strengthening Families had their summary, and they described factors that they believed all families and communities needed: reasonable access to essential needs, and we can go into this in a little more in depth here pretty soon. Looking at social support and connection, racial and social justice, and we're hearing more and more about this, and I'm glad to see this coming forward. I'm glad to see that this study was showing that, but it wasn't lost in some of the early study. It just wasn't recognized. Shift in the social contract to include shared community responsibility. I think that unfortunately, in a lot of ways, we've gotten away from that community responsibility for child and family well-being. An example I'll use when I say we've gotten away from it. When I was growing up, and yes, that was many, many years ago, but when I was growing up, even when I was raising my own children, everybody in the neighborhood watched everybody else's kids. Now we don't do that so much. Kids don't run the neighborhoods, and it's a safety thing. I understand that. Having had guardianship of small kids in the last 20 years, I was always careful, a little more protective than I was with my own children because the environment's changed. But if we can get back to some of that shared community responsibility for our children and our families' well-being, we're going to build a lot stronger environments and a stronger country, stronger state. I can remember checking in a couple of times a day, and the rest of the time I was out with, and if I was doing something I shouldn't and another parent saw me, oh, I heard about it and it was okay. Looking at community resilience, that's really what we're talking about as we build protective factors. We're building resiliency in our communities. And it's a sustained ability of a community to use available resources. Looking at the energy, the communication, transportation, food, being able to respond to different crises, to withstand events that happen, to recover from adverse situations, building community resilience. And it allows for the adaptation and growth of a community after a disaster strikes too. I mean, the news has been full of disasters now, out in California with the flooding, in Hawaii with the terrible fires. Our communities, how are we going to come back together in all these areas until we can build some community resiliency? I found this model that I put in here when I looked at the study of it. And actually, the resource isn't showing here. The resource was, I wonder what happened to that. Psychology. No, that should be on that. Nope, it isn't. Okay. I will let you know, because this was a very detailed model. And it was published looking at community resiliency with a lot of data and stuff. But I loved the model when I looked at it. I thought, this is what we're talking about: building community resiliency, building adaptive capacity, building equity, which we know is so important. And all these things fit into it. We have to look at the assets, the hazards, the vulnerabilities, and then the capital resources that we can use to sustain some kind of community resiliency. I just really like this model. Gives you something to look at and begin to understand the importance. As we look at moving forward, I pulled this out of the Communities That Care because I really liked this model. It's simple, and all these other models fit into it, and I'm going to tie that into it. But looking at getting started, getting organized, developing a profile of your community so that you know what it looks like now, and creating a plan. And then how do you implement it and evaluate it? That's very much like University Associates learning experiential model of when an individual does an activity in the process, you take them through from the getting started to being able to step back and implement and evaluate.
And that's basically the model that we use for ROSC too when we enter into a community. That's the exact, just worded different, a little different, but
right,
same concept.
It's not that complicated, and so many of the models that are out there make it very complicated. And I know there's research behind those, but I think as we start looking at things in our community and we start wanting to build things, sometimes it helps if you have this in the back of your mind, even if you're using other models that have been required or offered to you. So we're going to kind of break this down. One thing that I think is really important, and this came out of looking at the strengthening families, as they look at protective factors and stuff. They aren't that different from the Hawkins and Catalano, but they're more condensed, and they were ones that were generated through their 2020 study. The community must recognize that protecting children and families and creating resilient families and communities is everyone's job. It's not just given to our political people, to our administrators of communities. It's everyone's job, and that's what I love. Kyle, jump in here. Love about ROSC. It's everyone's job.
Yeah, it's in our community. I live in a smaller community, and so the substance use is not just the individual problem because it's affecting every single person in that community in one way or the other. So in order to work towards getting that better, everybody has to get on board and not work in silos no more. I figured that's one thing that ROSC has been doing good is like people and agencies act in their own silos and then getting them to know what the other people are doing. And, maybe I can help you in this area and you can do this in this other area. And then just begin that conversation is priceless. It's very important.
Yeah, I agree. It's great. Okay, as we look at this getting started, the community readiness assessment. There are tools out there to do all these things. And you have to find one that fits your environment. Doing a huge city compared to doing a neighborhood, compared to doing a very small rural group, you may need different tools, something that fits the way you do it. Are you doing personal interviews, et cetera, and identification of key individual stakeholders and organizations. The one thing I'll say about that is when you look at ROSC, that's exactly what they've done. It's this whole mix of key individual stakeholders and organizations. And the thing that I think is so wonderful, especially as we try and address the whole stigma issue around mental health and substance use disorder in our families and communities, is ROSC includes people with lived experience, people that are on a recovery journey, families that are on a recovery journey, getting input from them rather than viewing it from the outside and saying, oh, it's because of this and this and this. We don't know what's gone on. People that have that lived experience do. and they can say, this is what I needed. This is what would have helped me in this community, in this family. So,
No,
gotcha.
that's important.
Yeah.
They are like the driving force of the Ross because they've had the experience of, I needed this. Like, if this was here, it would have been so much easier for me to do this. And just those voices are crucial. And even on our council, we actually have a lot of people with lived experience, and they have voiced so much that, it can be overlooked. Like, yeah, those looking in can kind of have a general idea, but really those who are in it actually can tell you more in depth. And I think that's just without a doubt the most important factor in a council.
Yeah, I agree. And it's that inclusion that got me really excited, as I said, in that first committee 6 years ago. And listen to all the, sitting there with some pretty important people, and I'm just here to represent a family. But I've had a lot of years. I've had 40 years in this field, so I have learned a lot. But the inclusion of people that were on a recovery journey, and that requirement, and the fact that from the state level, actually the federal level down, they were looking at the importance of that, I find exciting. And I love that concept. And it opens up a whole new avenue for people on a recovery journey to feel valued and to learn skills and to share their experiences and give it back, not just through 12-step programs that only impact part of it, but to impact their entire community.
No, I agree. I was a little less than a year sober, sitting on my first Ross meeting, and they're sitting there asking me questions. I'm like, oh, okay, and at that time, my input was valued, and I didn't know that, but
Right.
This is a whole different concept of service, because it's not just serving like in your little 12-step community. The bigger picture is what really needs change, that whole systematic change.
Right.
And just being able to be a part of that is really cool. So I understand what you meant. Like, I don't feel like I should be here. There's a judge over there.
Right.
There's a cop over there, sitting all on the same table talking about how can we make this better for this community, the people in recovery in this community.
Right. So it's finding, I guess my question, let me see where we're up here. Okay. Kyle, one thing that I would ask you, how did you guys identify those people that you brought in? I mean,
like the stakeholders.
Yeah.
Well, you just want to see, like, in my mind, it was who has the most immediate interactions with people in substance use. So that would be law enforcement, that would be probation, judicial. But then you got those who are in agencies such as people in substance use treatment, mental health treatment. I actually knew a lot of people in the recovery community, so it was easy for me to just talk with them. But from there, it really just branched out, like, all right, now who else do we need to be able to bridge these gaps that they're seeing? And then it just kind of expands from there, and expands the more conversations you have with people in the community.
Right. Thank you. I'm tying in some of the stuff from these other programs with this model as we go through it. So this is again from the Strengthening Families. The community level work is work aimed at creating positive change for the community as a whole. Concrete supports for families. Policies that need to be in place. So if you're looking at the stakeholders, these are things that you want to be able to get information from them. What are concrete supports that you need from someone that's actually experienced early recovery? What kind of help and direction do they need? What kind of policies need to be in place so that it's safe for them to start looking for a place to live, for a job, being able to address what might be legal issues that create barriers, and how do you go about working around that, not working the system negatively, but in a positive way to move forward? What are programs that are available or can be done? And public messaging, again, we're back to the stigma thing, and I love it. Statewide, ROSC is addressing stigma in a very strong way, and I think that's wonderful. Those of you that are on here that work with ROSC programs, I recognized a few. Good for you. Thank you. Well, you can tell I like ROSC. I loved it when I was doing some mentoring with some of the teams as they started to grow. Real quick, I want to see if there's any chat stuff that I needed to address. Oh, somebody on here mentioned mandatory training for teachers. Well, let's hang on to that because I'm going to make some comments, hopefully, about that a little later. All right. We got started. We got identified our key stakeholders and all of that. So then the key leaders, you need to look at training the key leaders. And this talks about the board of communities that care. Well, this could be the council of ROSC. How do you train those, and building the community coalition through getting organized. You get these people together, you gather this information, you start talking about what you're going to do. But sometimes, and I've seen this, especially since the pandemic hit, 2 years after ROSC got kicked off. And 6 years ago, it really got a big start at the state level. And I know that because I had a granddaughter born the same week I was up in Governor State University. So it's easy for me to put those lines. That first year, it was still planning. The second year, the first cohorts took off and got funded. The next year, the pandemic hit. And those that got started, it was, everything started being virtual, and a lot of things kind of got pulled back. But there was still a heart at the center of it that kept some things going. And once we were able to start at all the different areas, reaching back out and working together again, even if a lot of it was virtual, it got real exciting. You really started to build a community coalition.
Mm-hmm.
As we talk about resiliency, I think I like this example because that's what we're talking about. As we build these coalitions, we're working towards resiliency in the community, and just visualize a balance of a scale or a seesaw. Risk and protective factors, building resiliency. Pretty soon you want that seesaw to show the protective factors that are so heavy that the others are gone. Or you can look at it the other way, whichever way wants to be positive. But it is a balance. Find a risk factor. How do you address it? You address that risk factor, and then suddenly there's another one that comes along that may be related. It's just looking at that counterbalance. Resilience is evident when a child's health, a family's functioning. There are great developmental tips for the way the family, child, and community work towards positive outcomes. Even resiliency's there, even when the negative outcomes start to sneak back in. And I think that's the importance of looking at resilience as it relates to risk and protective factors. Building resiliency is like kind of building that seatbelt, for example, or car seat or something. It's that protection as the negative starts to happen again. Thoughts, Kyle? You got your speaker off.
Oh, sorry. No,
Oh, you're fine.
I was just thinking about what you said yesterday, or what I told you yesterday about how that really helped me to organize it all in my mind, just like on the teeter-totter scales, and because it can be easy to just look around and then just see negative.
Right.
But when you organize it on one side, then you can just begin to see hey, there's good there too, and it kind of does even it out.
Yeah,
and that is the goal. But
yeah, resiliency builds that safety cushion. Then we need to develop a profile. Let's see if there's something that I really want to know. We're doing fine. You're going to collect your risk and protective factor and outcome data by whatever tool you've decided to use. You're going to collect information on the community resources and construct a community profile from the data. That could go back to that one diagram that I showed you of community resilience. I should have stuck that in here again. Just looking at just that model really addresses a lot of that. So. When you look at this strengthening family stuff, they have protective factor framework that I like. And I think it's important that we look at that as we're talking about developing a profile. We need to look at the individual, we need to look at the community, and then we need to look at public policy. I found this online and I thought it's just really neat, but I wish I'd been able to adapt it because it goes two ways. We're going to identify risk and protective factors, build protective factors and resiliency with our individual, and it's going to move outward. And we're pushing our social network, our environment, cultural values and norms of our community, and then it impacts our public policy. But it comes the other way too. Public policy definitely has influenced a lot of what we've seen as far as cultural values and norms, and not always to the positive. We're finding that out as we're experiencing some of the things going on in our country now. The environment, is impacted by that. It can be positive. All these can be positives and negatives, and you keep working down, and it ends up impacting the individual and the family. So it's really a two-way diagram. One of these days I'll get good enough to actually do that and maybe make it where it moves around. But the protective factors framework that came up is really coordinating across systems. And here's all these systems that we need to get talking to each other. That's what a lot of our community organizing is about, whether it's ROSC or some of the others. Danville has what's called Step up in Vermilion County. They do a lot of these same things with very large groups down into smaller groups. And it's exciting to see the outcome of a lot of these things that have been generated by doing that. Communicating more effectively, being able to talk to each other and feel safe. Knowing what language to use, what words to use. Again, you go back to addressing stigma. What words to use are important. Shifting the focus from intervention to prevention and promotion. Let's promote healthy lifestyles. Yes, do we need to intervene, but we need to do it from a prevention and promotion viewpoint. We can intervene, but make it a positive intervention, not a negative one. And I love a lot of what they've done with this, taking what we know is important out of the Hawkins and Catalano work, and they've been able to reconstruct it and build with that to offer more resources. They identified several steps: conduct key informant interviews with stakeholders, engage with parents and community members to understand their perspectives, review previous information addressing the community conditions essential to promote the family and community well-being with effective strategies. Was this one of the things that you wanted to comment on, Kyle, or have we already talked about it?
No, I can. So basically this little step is what we do, and we just make a needs assessment for the community by saying, getting all the information that we've talked with people and getting it all in just a document that says like what the community has, what it could use. Just it's almost step by step what we use as the ROSC model too. So yeah, everything that you're saying is the exact same thing that we do and see it as too.
Cool. The 2020 group of the Strengthening Families, in their executive summary, they listed factors that group identified as being important, as protective factors, and to build resiliency, because they use both those terms. We're going to build protective factors and we're going to strengthen resiliency. Essential and basic needs. They need things, high quality, affordable, and equitable learning tools. From little ones through 12 and adult education. And for people in early recovery, this is important. People coming out of recovery that haven't had, maybe they never did finish high school. Maybe they may not have gotten that far. They may have struggled with that. Maybe they didn't have any kind of training for the skills. This is important. It's an essential and basic need. Healthcare for people in recovery and for the families, for the community. Where do you go to get health care? A lot of rural areas really struggle with that. They might have a clinic that's open 1 or 2 days a week. What do you do in an emergency? Is there even an emergency care available? Transportation to get you where you need to go. If you need to go into, and you're lucky enough to be able to identify being able to go into treatment for substance use or mental health. How do you get there? Excuse me. How do you get there? How do you access the health care? How do you get your children to health care? I do a training on early parenting and early recovery. And one of the things, as I read a lot of the information and the resources out there around that, and it makes sense to me, is if you don't have a driver's license, if your time's really full of counseling and trying to find a job and everything else, oftentimes being able to get your child for their checkup or to get their updated shots is really difficult. That's where our communities can develop ways to support people to do that without embarrassment. And it's a biggie because it's come up in, like I said, in several of the resources that I read about issues around early recovery and parenting. How do you do that? How do you make enough hours in the day and keep yourself sane and in recovery? Another basic need, safe, affordable, and reliable housing. Are you going to go back into the neighborhood where it's drug houses and you were using? No, we need to look at supporting recovery for the families and the person that's on that recovery journey themselves with affordable and reliable, safe housing. You want your children and your family in safe housing. Food security. Where are you going to get your food? Where are the food pantries? How do I get there if I know where they are? What are the resources? How do I get SNAP? All those things are important. That's a role that Roscoe's been able to help with as far as the recovery navigators. And not just Ross, but recovery navigators are showing up in other areas of the whole treatment continuum, which is great. Economic opportunities. How do I find a job? How do I fill out an application? And it's not just the people that are on that recovery journey themselves, but family members, caregivers. If they've been living in the chaos, a lot of that stuff is just overwhelming to them. So what are the steps that we can do to build that resiliency and build that protective factor? And family-friendly employment. If I've got a sick kid and have to call in, am I going to lose my job? What I do with my kid because they can't go to daycare or they can't go to school. I can't leave them by themselves because then I'm in trouble. You know, it's craziness that are looking at those essential and basic needs that our communities need help with. Social support and connection, neighborhood cohesion. Neighborhoods that bond. We know our communities need a willingness to work toward long-term cultural shifts. We see our neighborhoods, even in rural areas, very much changing culturally. Ethnicities are changing that are in the neighborhoods. Looking at if we have more blended families, if we have more single parenting families, you know, those kinds of things are cultural shifts. And how do we support those as we go through this process, taking a look at that? Normalization of help-seeking behaviors. If you need help, you need to be able to ask, what are those resources? Where do I go? That's building resiliency, being able to feel like you can do that without embarrassment or without somebody judging you is important, which means we really have to educate our communities at large. A collective acknowledgement that parenting is hard. Parenting is hard. I have 3 children, grown children. I have grandchildren. I have great-grandchildren. But parenting is still hard oftentimes with those 3 grown ones because I'm here. They still need me as a resource. And they just need that cheering that I can give them for the positives more than anything. Or a help in a bump in the road. It's hard. And we know that parents and communities benefit from that support of each other. Okay, racial and social justice, fostering anti-racist and equitable social structure. This is becoming more and more important as we look at what's happening in our country. Developing norms and practices that address historical and cultural racism. There's a lot of controversy about that, but you need to do your research. Find out what, to the best of your knowledge, is correct and support it. Develop those norms and practices in a positive way. And community members that are willing to commit to actively work to change system-wide biases so that everybody can thrive. You know, whether it's you're looking at the economics, whether you're looking at the culture, whether you're looking at the ethnicity, it's so that everybody can thrive. And then social contact, shift in community level social norms. If the only place to socialize is the local bar, that can be a problem. How do you change that in your community? How do you build resiliency for people that need to move forward and away from the bar? Fundamental change in the social contract within your communities. And a lot of that is, no, we're not going to meet in the bar. We're going to meet in the church basement or the community basement. High-level prevention efforts and messaging, restorative justice practices, getting the courts straightened around and adjusted, and a culture of looking out for one another, no matter what. It's kind of that unconditional love in my definition. Any comments, Kyle? Okay. Then you're going to create a plan. Let me see the time. Okay, we're doing okay. Define your outcomes. Out of all these things we've talked about, you're going to have to prioritize. What are the first factors you're going to do? Yeah, Kyle. How did you guys do that?
Well, this is what we do, our strategic goal. This step is like we form the strategic goal for how we're going to go into the community. So we've already heard the voices. We already know what resources are there. We already know the strengths and weaknesses, barriers and gaps. So this is where we begin to address those barriers and gaps and to support the strengths that are already in the community as well. So this is like part of our strategic goal is partnering with Illinois Family Resource Center to provide education for families, because believe it or not, like a rural community doesn't have a lot of resources or anything for families. So this is a way to provide education and address stigma as well. So, you know, this is part of what we do. So it's not just on just a person who struggles with substance use disorder. We're trying to get to the community members who have family members, you know, and educate them. Where can they go? That kind of stuff.
Right. Thank you. I like this: select tested, effective interventions. One of the things that we have offered for the last 2 years is training from the National Association for Children of Addiction. NACOA started about 30, maybe 35 years ago. I mean, the pioneers in this field of looking at families and children with substance use disorder was really brought to highlight with them. That's Claudia Black and Kathleen Brooks and Sharon Wegscheider Cruz and Jerry Moe, and I can go on down a whole list of people, and some of them are still really actively doing things. But they started developing curriculum to do parenting programs. How do we, and it's part of where Hawkins and Catalano came out of, is looking at risk and protective factors that fit in with a lot of this. And those things have been pulled into some curriculum. What we've started doing is evidence-based, which means that it's been tested. We know it's effective. We have been offering training to community groups, and it's been into community teams in the Celebrating Families curriculum. And what's interesting is it's been mostly Ross councils. We've done it 2 years in a row. We do 4 teams a year. And out of that last year, the 4 teams, all 4 were Ross councils because they wanted different people from the community to come in and be able to do that. It's one of the few curriculum that is really developed for, it's ideal for outpatient services, but it can be done out in the community too. Developed for parents in early recovery. How do you parent? Because quite often, as we know, because of the generational issues of substance use disorder, they may have not have been parented with the most ideal models either. So it's how do you become that parent that takes care of your recovery and then also addresses the issues that your children need to know so that you can come back together in whatever that family looks like and move forward. Had a lot of when I was facilitating it, we had a lot of grandparents that came into that program with them too. So it's looking at that family. We offer that training that's looking at select tested and effective interventions. It's great. Another one they've got is the children's program kit, and we're going to be offering that to communities to go through that training this year. We'll be the first 10 people that want to apply, they'll get the curriculum and they'll have the opportunity to go through that. And that addresses looking at kids have a right to recovery too. They need to know that they aren't alone. It's not a parent program. It's a program that can be conducted in sites where there are children. It might be a school counselor. It might be a church support group, all those different things. So it's looking at that. And you're going to develop and create your action plan. How are you going to use these tools? And I mean, I'm just talking about things that pertain directly to substance use disorder, but you have to look at what are transportation plans that we know work? How do you, the safe passages that many of the law enforcement agencies and offices are now doing. We know that works, that it gets people to treatment rather than to correctional systems. Taking a look at what's out there is important, and then developing that, and then taking a look at your evaluation plan. In order to do this planning, you need to seek funding to support the research activities. And people say, yeah, that's pretty obvious. Kyle, have you got any comments on that? Because I'm not sure where a lot of the Ross councils are going for sustainability.
We are looking into that ourselves, so I don't have as much information as other Ross councils would. Okay.
But it's how do you sustain what you're doing? I mean, are the funding for Ross councils through super, the Division of Substance Use Prevention and Recovery, which funds the Illinois Family Resource Center. That funding is going to continue in some ways, but for how long, we don't know. How much, we don't know. How it will shift. So how do we keep these wonderful, and it's amazing to me as I did some mentoring of new cohorts, what's happening in areas, places that could not find a Ross coordinator. Once they found one, things have just blossomed because the stigma is starting to go away. The activities and things are starting to pop up. I think one of them that I really like to see this being done that's supportive of our recovery community and families is Laundry Day. Identified that people didn't have anywhere to do laundry, didn't have any money. So a couple of the Ross councils in our area have been able within their communities to develop a day that they can tell people to come in and do their laundry. How good does that make you feel as someone that had nowhere to go, no resource to go, to know that you're respected enough? You can have clean clothes. It's important. Looking at those things is very important. That there's activities in the park being done. Doesn't cost you anything. Bring your family. Interact in a positive way with your community. Those kinds of things are really important. Develop a policy agenda that identifies policy and legislation that support community conditions positive. I mean, I think that this takes time to be able to reach that point, but it's working with your drug courts. It's working with your child welfare agencies. It's working at these places that really operate with policy and see if you can't generate an agenda that helps take care of your families. Combine the results from your surveys and other sources into a comprehensive concise. Community protective factors framework. Don't look at all the negatives and go, oh, we can fix it. How do you build the protective factor and then build resiliency that'll keep it going? Implement and evaluate. This is where people go, oh no. Form task forces, even if you're very small. Look at who can sit back and evaluate. How can you do those? You may go back to your interviews over here that you had with Get Organized. Who are those stakeholders? How has the plan worked for the stakeholders? What do you see happening in your community? What's the arrest rate? What's the rate of children behavior being improved? Let's put it that way, rather than looking at the negative. Pay attention to my own recommendations. How do you sustain collaborative relationships rather than, okay, this ended, we're done? Because that's when this will all fall apart. It's that sustainability that's so important to keep those relationships. So what's our next step? We've learned this. What do we do next? Evaluate processes and outcomes, and then adjust your programming, adjust your behavior. This goes back to University Associates model for individual learning process. This is almost the exact same thing, but it's how communities learn and operate versus how individuals take an activity and learn and process it and implement it. And sometimes that's the first step. I know that it's really important when you've brought people in, you've got families coming in for treatment and coming into groups, and you start doing activities. If you don't do that whole process of what does it mean to them and how does it impact them, you've lost it. That's same true here. How has what you've done impact your stakeholders and your people of importance that have been part of this process, and then the community at large? The last one, I don't want to end on a negative, but I think that this was really important. This came out of the Strengthening Families. They were saying to take a look at your policy makers and practitioners, that unfortunately, oftentimes because of current complex government policies, things are limited. It's difficult to access services. And oftentimes it's the cause of the stress and the risk factors rather than helping reduce it. So you have to look at including those directed toward early care and education, child protective services, adult mental health, family economic supports. Who can you bring in that can promote safe and supportive environments and stable caring for relationships for children that need it, so that parents and families that need it, and then communities at large? I think that was an important thing to look at. That's kind of a negative, saying that part of the barriers are our own policymakers and practitioners, but it's there. But this is what we want. We want to see communities that work with their people in their community. What can you do to take care of you? That our people are getting the medical care and the help that they need. That we're coming together in our neighborhoods and our communities and holding hands and doing things together and supporting each other. That we're looking at our faith and our schools and the things that are important. That we have people volunteering across the board to help make things happen. And the thing that's great is a lot of Ross Council is that. It's people volunteering their time and their commitment. And then most of all, one of the things I think is most important is, how do you come together, celebrate a meal together, interact together, share together, build the strength in that community? This is resiliency right here. And it's the outcome of a lot of the things that we've done. Thoughts, Kyle, before I sign off? We got 2 minutes.
No, I just think it is cool how some of the Ross Council, so we're having a recovery picnic in September, and basically our whole council is primarily of volunteers, the people who are helping us plan this, and they're supplying the food, they're supplying items that we need there. And it's just cool how they step in, and you know, that they don't even have a background in substance use in their own lives, but they're just here because they care and they want to help, and that build that resiliency and that recovery capital in the community. So, I mean, I think
Right.
it's cool.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to ask, as I sign off here, there will be a survey come up. I ask that you please fill that out. We will be sending stuff out. It may take a week or two to get stuff out because I got a conference coming up that may get in the way. The other thing, I did say that I would say something about schools because I noticed there were several chat comments. There was a curriculum done by Prevention First several years ago called Breaking the Chain, and it impacted a lot of what we saw happening in the schools. I was part of that development along with Pam Wall and some other people. And we're thinking about resurrecting that and seeing if we can't get some of that training back into our communities that then in turn can offer that information to the schools. So stay tuned because it may very well come, and it's called Breaking the Chain. I want to sign off and say thank you all. I've loved having you here. I love sharing these ideas. I like being able to pull out some of that basic research that started all this and see how we've moved ahead into creating wonderful environments and communities. Until next time, thank you.
Thanks,
See you
guys.
later. Bye-bye.